So, a little bit about myself. First of all, I am one of the technical trainers here at Quanta Training, covering a smorgasbord of different topics, really, from cybersecurity through to a little bit of web development, business automation, networking, that sort of thing. And one of the hats that I've now put on is also around artificial intelligence, around AI. And we've chosen for both this webinar and indeed our general course offerings to focus on Microsoft's Copilot first and foremost. And the reasons for that I'll talk about very shortly. But first of all, let's just go through what actually is Copilot. Well, Copilot is something that's known as an LLM. Okay, and Copilot is an LLM that is based on ChatGPT-4 and DALL-E 3. Now, an LLM, for the uninitiated, is a large language model. Basically, think of it as some software that takes a whole load of publicly available data, so websites, documents that are online, etc., billions effectively of data points. And what it does is it indexes them so that it can recall that information later, but it also establishes relationships and connections between those data points in a way that is not too dissimilar to what a human being might do in terms of saying, well, actually, that X fact is also linked to Y, for example. And I've got some worked examples that we're going to take a look at very shortly. So one thing that I often hear is that people see these large language models, these LLMs, these AI such as ChatGPT, such as Copilot, as effectively actually just a slightly better search engine. And don't get me wrong, that's not a bad place to begin, but actually it's quite a lot more than that. Now, Copilot, being Microsoft's LLM, is hosted in the cloud on Microsoft's Azure infrastructure. And it is, in fact, a replacement for Cortana. So if any of you are missing Cortana from the bottom of your Windows operating systems, etc., wondering where on earth that's gone, well, that's because Copilot is Cortana, but they've just rebranded it, as Microsoft are wont to do. If a particular product isn't particularly taking off, they do have a tendency to give it a new name, new lick of paint, and hope that that gets it perhaps relaunched and a little bit more popular. It's fundamentally a virtual assistant, so you can give it prompts. That's how these LLMs are actually initiated, how you actually initialize them to give you something back. You give them a prompt, a text-based prompt, and what it does is it then responds to you. The way in which these generative AI, these co-pilots, chat GPTs, etc., actually respond to you is really quite interesting. So if you ask a human being a question, what they will normally do is they will then think about their response. So what they will do is they will think, right, what I'm going to say is, I'm going to explain generative AI to you. So what is generative AI? I'll just have a quick think about that. Right, that's how I'm going to put it. And we'll then respond in terms of sentences that hopefully make some kind of coherent sense. The way that an LLM works, though, is a bit different. It also tries to recall information and make links around the prompt that you've provided it with. But the way that it then generates that response is word by word. And it uses a series of probability algorithms to work out what the most likely next word should be. And so it means that it doesn't know the entire sentence that it's going to say. It starts and then just figures out, it'll figure the rest out as it goes. Basically, think of it like the first Wallace and Gromit film, when Gromit is sat on a train putting the train track down as it's going along. Okay, that's how an LLM actually gives you a response. It's just putting each train track down, putting each word down as it actually goes through and figures things out. And that can lead to some interesting responses. But actually, over the last few years, we've seen a massive acceleration in basically the probabilities of those words that the LLMs can use to generate their responses. And you get a much more human response, and you're getting a lot less in terms of mistakes and what we refer to as hallucinations, and more on those later. The other thing that Copilot is, and the reason that we're focusing on it here, is that it's everywhere, certainly within the Microsoft ecosystem. It's on your Windows desktop, it's in your Office applications, it's in Microsoft 365 Online, it's in Power Automate. It's popping up all over the place. And so it's something that I think is actually quite important to focus on within organizations, within the workplace, because even if you're looking at it and thinking, Yeah, I can't. It looks like a solution in search of a problem from our point of view. Not really sure it's something that's going to particularly revolutionise the way that we're doing work. The thing is, people are going to start noticing it, and they're probably going to start using it. And as we'll see, one of the challenges with using these AI, using these generative AI, these LLMs, is that if you are using it in a way that you haven't necessarily thought about, you can get perhaps some unintended consequences. And we've seen issues. There are case studies cropping up around the world. There was a lawyer over in America who I believe he actually got disbarred because used ChatGPT in order to generate some case notes, and it referenced for precedence a case that actually had never occurred. That was one of those hallucinations that the AI had. And without that sanity checking by the lawyer, they submitted this and then turned out basically that it was just false information. So it is something that people are going to start using, and it's quite important that we make sure that they're using it correctly. In much the same way that you probably wouldn't let somebody come into your organization and start driving a forklift on their first day without a bit of training, we probably want something similar in terms of thinking about who should be using these tools and for what purpose when it comes to things like AI. So let's have a little look at some examples of what Copilot and similar Gen AIs is capable of doing, shall we? So what I've done when I put this little presentation together here is I asked Copilot to describe to me, I simply said to it, explain what a generative AI is, okay? And on the left here, you've got the response that Copilot gave me. Okay, so what we've got is a summary. So form of artificial intelligence, create original content in response to a user's prompt, etc. Using learning models, and it can produce text, images, video, audio, or even software code. Great. Okay, that's a good description. On the right-hand side, over here, I've then got what Gen AI is according to Wikipedia, and I just took the sort of top blurb. And what we can see is that between the two, there's actually quite a lot of similarity. And in fact, Copilot's response bears a striking resemblance to an awful lot of the work that I did at university, which is to say that it's basically exactly the same as something that was available on Wikipedia, just with the words rearranged and maybe a couple of synonyms thrown in. And that's fundamentally what this has done. And in fact, Copilot is kind enough to include a source that says, actually, you know what? I got this from IBM's page where it talks about what a generative AI actually is. And so when we're just asking these Gen AIs, Copilots, etc., for factual information, what is X? Okay. Basically, it acts as fundamentally just a slightly better search engine. It will give you the information that it has available to it. Now, much like a search engine, it's only as good as the information that is going into it. So you may have heard in terms of data analysis, working with databases, etc., junk in, junk out. Well, that applies here as well. If we've got junk data and we're asking our copilots, our generative AIs about junk, we're going to get junk out the other side. They don't really have fact checking built in beyond either the probabilities that they've got. So the answer that crops up the most likely, the most is going to be the most probable response in conjunction with some user-based tuning. So I always like to think of these Gen AIs as basically being like children, which is to say that they're capable of learning incredible things, and left to their own devices, they'll actually learn quite a lot on their own. But the problem is that they probably need a little bit of guidance so that they are actually learning the right things and being able to differentiate fact from fiction. And an AI is absolutely no different. Left to its own devices, it'll just trust whatever you tell it. Got some examples of that a little bit later. So just looking at a basic fact response here, we can see actually we're not gaining a whole lot beyond tools that have been available to us for decades. But what if we start getting a bit more clever with the way that we ask our questions? Well, got some further examples here. So for example, I provided Copilot with some additional prompts. And I said, right, what I'd like you to do, explain to me what a generative AI is, first of all, as a haiku. And it came back immediately with generative minds and code stands, create anew, art blooms from their lines. Very poetic. And here what it's done is it's taken what it knows about generative AI and then the structure that it knows for a haiku, and it's combined the two. And it's done that straight away. So incredibly clever. I asked it to explain a generative AI in a way that a 5-year-old would understand. So it talks about, for example, a magical computer that can make up stories or create songs. It's a friendly robot artist. Now, we'll come back to that artist idea a little bit later on when we talk about perhaps some of the risks and challenges with AI. And you can see it uses its imagination to make cool stuff. So that's something that a child can understand. And then I even asked it to explain what generative AI is in French. Now, I don't speak French, but I put that through Google Translate and it held up, looked pretty good. And again, it did that straight away. It's even got the accents in the right place. It's brilliant. So at the click of a button, basically, I can get these responses back in ways that, yeah, admittedly, I could possibly do myself, but it would take quite a lot longer. Some slightly more creative examples. I asked it to use Game of Thrones as a metaphor. And so what it did was it used its knowledge of Gen AI and its knowledge of Game of Thrones, and it gave me examples of some houses for different types of generative AI that it thinks would match up. So you've got the Starks, the Faceless Men, the Greyjoys, etc. And again, it's that level of creativity there. Although all it's doing is taking, again, this idea of billions of data points and then just creating relationships between them that, this is something that if I sat down with people and said, right, if we wanted to describe Gen AI using Game of Thrones, what do we think? We'd probably come to a similar conclusion, but nowhere near as quickly. And then last one, in terms of some of these slightly silly examples, I asked it to explain generative AI in the style of Gilbert and Sullivan, and it put together a short little song there for me. So you've got a chorus, and then you've got a soprano AI that sings a solo. And again, this is something that I could possibly have come up eventually with on my own, but the thing is, I don't really have a creative bone in my body. It would have taken me a very long time to get a haiku with the right scanning in any way, shape or form, or to come up with anything that sort of tracks in terms of the rhyming and the rhythm, etc., of the song that we've got here. Now, at this point, I may be losing some of you, and you may be thinking, this is great. But again, we come back to this idea of a solution without a problem. This seems like something fun to play with, but what about the workplace? We don't do a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan in the workplace. The opportunity to crack out a haiku is few and far between. And fair enough. These are just some examples as to how we can use these additional prompts to get it to work far harder for us. So, how can it actually help us in the workplace? Well, ways that AI can help us. Automate repetitive tasks. If you've got people that are doing things on a regular basis that involve, for example, moving information around or manipulating data or repeating a task where, for example, they are notifying people when a change takes place or walking bits of information around an organization physically, we can get an AI, if we can get it to understand our processes, etc., we can get it to basically automate that for us. It can find information quickly, far quicker than we can find it ourselves. Now, admittedly, things like searches and indexing, etc., have been around for a very long time, basically as long as databases have. But this also enables us to look at multiple data sources and create relationships between them. So if an AI has enough data points from our own data sources, it can create relationships much quicker than we would be able to do so as human beings. Now, on that point, it's worth mentioning that LLMs and Copilot as well, they use publicly available data. They don't use your information, okay? So everybody's basically querying the same set of data, unless you decide to give it your information. And we need to be really careful when we do that. So things like making sure that permissions are appropriate and the scope of any copilots that we customize in this way, need to make sure that the security is really, really sound with that so that we don't have sensitive data that's available to those that shouldn't have access to it. I'll be touching upon that. I'm going to give you some worked examples a little bit later on. So we will explore that concept. But unless you've specifically done that, all it's going to find is stuff that people could find anyway. And it can find that information really quickly. What this ultimately means is that it can free up people's time. So if we have got people doing those repetitive tasks that aren't necessarily themselves adding value to the organization, but are sort of enablers. It has to be done in order to free people up to, or enable people, sorry, to actually do the bit that really adds value to the business in terms of analytics, in terms of sales, marketing, whatever it might be. And so this can free people up so they're spending more time doing the bits that they really add value to, which tends to be the more rewarding bit of your work anyway, and less on the stuff that is a little bit more repetitive and perhaps isn't quite as rewarding from a day-to-day working point of view. It can unlock creativity. As I say, I'm not a composer, I'm not a lyricist, I'm not a poet. And so the ability to create things that actually, admittedly, we're probably not going to be reaching the levels that a real master of their craft would be, but it's going to be a lot better than what I could do, certainly within the time frame on my own. And when we look at some of the Gen AIs that can generate images, well, this just goes even further. Rather than just using stock images where you say, right, we want a picture that looks a bit like this, for example. So I did some work recently with a wine company where they were looking to generate an image, obviously topical, of people that were watching football drinking red wine from one of their promotions. Okay. And the thing is, I'll be honest with you, not a lot of people drink red wine while they're watching the football. And certainly when you look at stock images, people tend to be, if you're looking at the football, they're either watching at home with perhaps beer or with soft drinks, or they're in a stadium, not a lot of red wine to be seen. And so if you're trying to use something that already exists, you might be a bit disappointed. You could schedule a photo shoot, but then you've got to get a photographer, models, you've got to get a location. That could get quite expensive and time consuming. Or you could just go onto something like Midjourney, give it an accurate prompt, and then within moments, you've got exactly what you wanted. So it can really unlock that creativity and speed that process up quite a bit. Again, this is not to say that this is necessarily perfect or without some ethical considerations, but we'll come on to those a little bit later. And then how else can AI help us in the workplace? Rapid data analytics. Being able to think faster than people can and form relationships between data sets, etc., draw conclusions that we could probably get to, but not necessarily quite as quickly. Now, I do in fact have a few examples now just to take you through in real time in terms of interacting with AI, specifically Copilot, in a few different areas. Okay, before I go into the live example though, here are some in classic Blue Peter fashion that I prepared earlier. So I asked Copilot why somebody should choose Quanta Training as a training provider. Shameless plug here. So it came back with just some generic stuff about why you should choose a training provider. So generic question gets a generic answer in this particular case. But if I was putting together a proposal, that could save me a bit of time in terms of popping that together. And that makes sense. There's good answers in there. But then if I crafted my prompt slightly differently, I then asked it, okay, why should someone choose Quanta Training as a training provider if budget is their main concern? And here it then started coming back with something that was a little bit more targeted. How was it able to do that? Well, it was able to do that because it had crawled and effectively learned from Quanta's different websites. And so, although I've removed them here, each of those actually came back with a reference that pointed to either press releases or marketing material that Quanta themselves had released. So it wasn't making this up, it was pulling this from different data sources to give me an output that I was looking for. So really quite powerful with the speed at which it was able to do that. But what I want to take you through now are some examples of doing this stuff in real time. I've given you some Blue Peter stuff there, so where I've already generated these responses from different prompts. But let's have a little look at how this works actually in a live fire environment, shall we? So the examples I'm going to take you through here are going to be on the Windows desktop. I'm going to show you it as part of Microsoft's Power Automate in 365, and I'm going to show you a Copilot that I've made myself effectively using Copilot Studio. The Microsoft 365 apps, which is where you can get it in things like Word, PowerPoint, Excel, etc. I'm not going to demonstrate that here, but again, shameless plug, if you happen to attend our Copilot for End Users course, it features on that. So, starting with Copilot on the desktop. Any of you that have got Windows 11 and an organization that hasn't clamped down on this little icon will spot that on the bottom menu, you've likely got this colorful little icon for Copilot, your everyday AI companion. Within here, we have the ability to basically ask it questions and to provide it with prompts and to get its responses back. And this is what I was using for those previous prompts that I showed you. Now, I'm going to use, first of all, some sort of general examples, and I'm going to show you some more productivity-based stuff. So first of all, I'm going to provide Copilot with, so I've got some predefined prompts here just so that we don't fall foul of my propensity for spelling mistakes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to provide Copilot, first of all, with a logic test. Okay, so I'm going to ask it, what weighs more, a kilogram of feathers or a kilogram of sand? And what we should find, there we go, Copilot very quickly comes back and very proudly telling me that they actually have equal mass, so they weigh the same. Absolutely correct. So I'm going to test whether or not it can apply that knowledge in a slightly more complicated question. So James and Greg are in a plane over Worcester. James drops a 1 kilogram bag of feathers. Sarah drops a 1 kilogram bag of sand. Which bag hits the ground first? And what we'll find is, using its knowledge, there we go, of Galileo at the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it very confidently tells me they will both hit the ground at the same time. But the thing is, much like an overconfident person, Copilot has made a bit of a mistake here, because I asked it about James and Sarah dropping their different bags. Thing is, never told it Sarah was on the plane. So what happens if I start going back to Copilot and saying, actually, you've made a mistake there, that's not quite right. So I'm going to go back to it and just say, that's wrong. Sarah isn't on the plane, so couldn't drop the sand. And there we go. It's clever enough and humble enough to come back and say, yeah, you're absolutely right. She's not on the plane, so couldn't drop the sand. So therefore, the feathers will hit the ground first. And the thing is, it does then remember this kind of series of events. So if I then say, so which bag hits the ground first? Again, very humble, very apologetic, and it remembers, because I've now informed it Sarah wasn't on the plane, that only James's bag would actually hit the ground. Now, the reason for this is because although Copilot uses publicly available data sources, so that's how it knows about Galileo and the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and how it knows about the mass of different things, etc., it also can then learn throughout the conversation. Now, this is something that frightens people on occasion, because you might think, well, wait a minute, if I tell this things while I'm prompting it, is it then going to remember that? Am I basically teaching this on Microsoft's behalf? But the thing about these LLMs is, as soon as this conversation is over, it will forget everything that you've provided it with. So if I reset my interaction with Copilot and take it back to the question that prompted that little exchange, let's see whether it remembers my little trick. And it does not. So again, it misses the fact that Sarah was not on the plane. So a little bit of a trick question there. Although, interestingly, can you see that while last time it told me about Galileo and the Leaning Tower of Pisa, this time it talks a little bit about air resistance and that sort of thing. So interestingly, I literally provided it with the exact same prompt, word for word, just copied and pasted. I got a slightly different response out of the other side. So again, unlike usual computer programs, which is where if you provide it with the same prompt, you get exactly the same thing out of the other side, we have got that creativity and those different links, and that is both a positive and a negative. But outside of logic puzzles, how can this help me in a sort of work environment? Well, let's imagine that I have a requirement to generate a PowerShell script that is going to import a whole load of users from a CSV file and put them into an Active Directory domain. Okay. So if I provide that as a prompt, and we'll see how it goes. There we go. And certainly, unlike me, it's actually remembered to put comments in its PowerShell script. So it gives you an idea as to what it's going to do. and it, there we go. So import CSV, import subprocess, it defines that within there, the domain, organizational unit, and then puts that into there. Although in this particular case, that's not, oh no, that is using, what an interesting way of doing that. Again, different inputs. So when I tested this quite extensively, it gave me a completely different response. I'll spin this up again in a moment. But it's actually done that running PowerShell through a command prompt, interestingly. So that will work, but what an interesting way of having done it. I'll tell you now, this is one reason that we're focusing on end users, certainly in terms of our training offering to begin with, because what I've found is that when it comes to development and it comes to people who are a little bit more technical using these tools, I always find application developers, etc., tend to be an awful lot like plumbers and electricians, which is if you've ever had somebody come to your house to do some work, you will often find that when they turn up, one of the very first things that they say is, "Oh, I wouldn't have done it that way." I often find it's very similar with people who write code. And in fact, I've just done it myself there, just looking at that. But if I just reset that, let's just give it another run at it and see how it gets on. But you do get these different responses coming out of the other side. And this is one of the things actually that I do want to focus on, is that you can't just use these things in isolation. You do need to have some knowledge around exactly what it is that you're asking it to do, because you need to be able to pick out mistakes or think, well, actually, that's not great. Maybe I could ask it in a different way. And here, can you see, I'm getting, I've copied and pasted again, reset my interaction. I'm getting a completely different response this time. Here, I'm actually getting some nice step-by-step explanations about what I should do, and then it's actually used PowerShell as opposed to nesting it within command prompt. Same prompt, different responses. So you really do have to be quite careful with these things. They're not necessarily always a silver bullet, although they are, again, very helpful. And you can see where it's got this information from. It gives you its sources. So it's just pulled it from there. Okay, right. Next example. Okay. I'm going to hop now into Power Automate. Power Automate is not AI, but Copilot does fit nicely within it. And it's where we can automate processes within a 365 environment. Oh, interesting. Jamie's posted in the chat there that yes, so different LLMs, they are able to beat some of those logic puzzles. Yes, Copilot's using a slightly older version, so it's a little bit easier to trick. But these things they do learn is the thing. So and some of the LLMs, they do record the conversation. Copilot doesn't, but some of the other ones do, so they get trained basically. So it's going to get harder and harder to differentiate between people and these AI, if I'm honest, which again might be a bit of a risk. But here we've got Power Automate, which can act as a connective tissue between different Microsoft products, enabling us to automate tasks based on triggers and then a subsequent set of actions. It's really, really powerful tool. The problem with it, and this is one of the things that I teach, the problem with it is that although it's designed to be for non-technical people, it's still quite technical. And this is where Copilot can really start to unlock some extra productivity. So let's say that I go into here and I want to create a new flow that is going to automatically set an out of office for me if I've got holiday in my calendar. Okay, so I'm going to give Copilot within Power Automate here a prompt: set my out of office when I have holiday in my calendar. Here's the prompt I'm going to provide it with. And what it will do, after just a few moments, is it will build me a little flow. Now, admittedly, still a little bit of work to do. I need to specify exactly which calendar it is that I'm in, which is my calendar. But sure enough, when an event is starting soon, and it looks 5 minutes ahead, set my automatic replies. And it even gives me a basic template within there. I can then take it a step further, and I might say, well, actually, I only want that to happen if the word holiday is included in the subject of the event in question. And I can provide that to Copilot. So rather than just asking it questions and getting responses out the other side, I actually get it to do stuff for me. So when we've actually got it integrated into these different applications, there we go. I'll go into there, subject contains holiday. So it lowers the sort of technical barrier to entry with an awful lot of these tools. I don't necessarily need to be an expert in this. I need to know a little bit about it, but I can actually get Copilot to do an awful lot of the work for me. And again, it comes back to that idea of freeing up time, speeding things up. It's really, really powerful at those things, but does require that somebody with an idea as to how these things work also casts an eye over these things to make sure that they are behaving in the way that we would necessarily expect, because there are, as we've seen, sometimes mistakes. We can actually take this a step further, because again, this is only using at the moment publicly available data points. I've created using Copilot Studio, which is an add-on that you can get as part of your 365 subscription, which enables you to create your own copilots. And you can choose whether it uses general knowledge, as it refers to it, which is basically your LLM sources, your public data, along with, you can provide it with knowledge from other data sources. So I've given mine a name, Quanta Mike, and I've given him a nice face as well. It's got a description, and I've also given it some basic instructions, so to be polite and helpful, and provide answers from the provided data sources, which it does admittedly include everything at the moment. I've then given it some knowledge. I've given it a Word document containing some Quanta facts. I've given it and I think I've got the Quanta facts. There we go. So these are the facts that I've provided it with. Quanta provide lunch at Osler's restaurant, meat, vegetarian, vegan options, etc. And I've also given it access to my OneDrive and the files contained within there, as well as Quanta's public website. And what I can now do is I can go into here and I can interact with basically my own customized Copilot. And I can ask it general questions. So I can ask it, for example, where is Quanta training located? And once it's had a little think about that, it should come back with a response for me. Oops, it hasn't timed out. Entirely possible that Mike has gone for a quick tea break. Let me just try resetting my connection to Mike there. Try that again. That may potentially have woken Mike up. There we go. And you can see that it comes back with a bit of information, and you can see where it's citing there as well. So from our website, as well as any of the other inputs. Okay, which is the Quanta facts that I gave it. I can then ask it questions that appear within there. So for example, do Quanta provide lunch? And it'll pull that information back. And ask it for contact information. There we go. And I might even be able to ask it for bits of subjective information as well. So if I ask it which trainer has the best fashion sense, turns out it's me. Now, this is where we run into one of the issues, particularly if we are training the AI using our own data sources. First of all, the reason that these work so well is that they've got billions of data points. And when we have our own data, there is a risk that we give it so few data points that actually it's not as able to make as many connections. So the more data you give it, the better it is at doing its job. But also, it will trust whatever you tell it, particularly if you're giving it this knowledge, these data sources. So we need to be careful. Again, junk in, junk out. We need to make sure that the information we're providing it with is actually accurate, which fortunately in this particular case it is, but that may not have been. Now, This does then bring us on to, so those are some examples of how we might use this in a workplace environment, but it's not all fun and games, okay? And as a result, within here, I've got some of the challenges with introducing AI, okay? So one of the challenges is user adoption. As with most advances in technology, there may very well be some pushback from people that think that it's going to impact, for example, their job security, or the knowledge that they've got might suddenly become available to other people and they're trying to keep that a little bit closer to the chest. You might get some pushback in terms of people actually adopting this. People are in general resistant to change, and this could be one of the things that you hear that people say, well, actually, I don't really want to use that. I'm worried it's going to kind of make me redundant effectively. And don't get me wrong, much like when the car was invented and started to become more widespread, people that worked at blacksmiths putting shoes on horses probably were at that point losing work. There are going to be examples of that, but in reality, there's actually a big opportunity to make people's lives easier using these tools if they're using them appropriately. So although user adoption and resistance is going to be a challenge, you may very well be able to overcome that from an organizational standpoint by presenting it as an opportunity. But that is not to say that there aren't risks associated with it. There absolutely are. Data quality. So we mentioned this. It's all about the information that it's got going into it. If the information is wrong, then and consistently wrong, then the AI is going to produce that as fact because of the probabilities that it uses to generate its responses. And so that is problematic. More problematic is hallucinations, where it just makes something up. So you have had many examples where an AI has spotted something that looks about right and then is just used that to run with it. Its creativity has perhaps run away with it a little bit, and it started creating something that doesn't actually exist. I talked about the case law over in America. And those hallucinations, if we just trust them as gospel, can be very problematic. And it's why it's really important that we do have some kind of fact checking. We need to not just trust that things are absolutely correct. And don't get me wrong, I mean, that's no different to working with people. You can't necessarily trust that people are always getting things right the first time. Search engines will sometimes return incorrect results. So this is not unique to AI, but there is a risk that people sort of see it as infallible, and it's anything but. There may be high expectations in terms of what an AI can do, particularly quickly, and especially internally with organizations' data. If you don't have relationships between different data sets already, if your data isn't structured in a way that is logical, an AI is going to struggle to digest that, certainly quickly. So I've already worked with organizations that have had people at the C level that are saying, well, surely an AI can figure out the best time to call our customers, or the products that people are going to be interested in. And the thing is, if you've got something like that data available already, an AI might be able to get there. But if you're not already recording data that's relevant to that, it's not going to be able to draw those conclusions. So people may have lofty expectations about what an AI can do right off the bat. Inconsistencies. I mean, we just saw this in terms of the same prompt getting a slightly different response. In fact, in terms of the PowerShell prompt, completely different prompt. And one of those, I'll be honest with you, launching PowerShell through command prompt just didn't really make sense at all. And so those inconsistencies just again illustrate the need to have somebody with expertise just looking over the shoulder of what the AI is doing. Again, think of it like a new employee. You don't just kind of trust them to go off and do things on their own. You need someone to mentor them, particularly to begin with. And the Copilot Studio does enable you to, as an actual human being, sort of tailor and teach, if you like, the AI so that it behaves in a way that removes some of those inconsistencies and gives you a better result more often. And creating prompts is a skill. Talking earlier about the idea of the wine company that wanted people drinking wine watching football, they wanted it in a photorealistic manner. They wanted to describe like the sofas and the couple that were drinking, etc. Now, it is a skill generating all of that. You have people that class themselves as AI artists who are very good at generating those prompts. And while it is a skill, is it art? It's debatable. I mean, when I asked Copilot to describe a Gen AI itself as though talking to a 5-year-old, it actually did describe itself as an artist, interestingly. But is it an artist? Well, as I say, subjective. So these are some of the challenges that we have. It's not necessarily something that can be all singing, all dancing right off the bat, but there is a lot of opportunity there. And then we get, and this is the last topic here before I turn it over for any questions, the risks and ethical considerations that we may have. Plagiarism. At the end of the day, it is pulling from a large number of data sources. And although Copilot is very good on the whole at letting you know its sources, we need to make sure that we're also respecting that if we're going to pass work off as our own. For example, I have looked at using Copilot to generate course manuals to speed up my course development process. But the thing is, where's it getting the data for that course information from? Probably one of our competitors that's got something on the internet somewhere. And so I need to be really careful that I'm not just generating that and then passing that off as a Quanta product, if in fact it's effectively just a slightly reworded version of something that has already been produced and is the intellectual property of somebody else. So again, we can't just go into this and just immediately start saying, right, we're going to hoover this stuff up and produce content and start selling it, etc. Because if we get caught out, that could be really problematic, both in terms of our relationships and reputations, but also maybe from a legal standpoint as well. Although it is worth mentioning on that subject that particularly in this country, we are perhaps being a little slow in terms of the legislation around generative AI. So that's something to consider as well. If we were to integrate it too much into our processes at this point, future legislation could then hamper what these can actually do. We don't know at the moment, so it's a little bit unknown. Unchecked errors. So if we're not checking that what we've got is accurate and correct, it could possibly then have unforeseen consequences. There are issues with early models of LLMs that were used to produce, for example, content for web pages that didn't have proper error handling, leaving them vulnerable to things like SQL injection attacks, etc., which are things that an actual expert would have spotted, but it just wasn't being checked properly because people were trying to just get a really quick and easy way of generating code. There's a lack of transparency sometimes. So it might not necessarily tell you where it's getting its data from. Again, Copilot's actually really good at this, but not all of them are and not all of the time. And so that plays into the errors and the plagiarism. It makes it harder to basically trust it. Privacy concerns. I've talked about the fact that Copilot doesn't record your messages, but other LLMs do. And it's important to understand what happens to these prompts that I provide it with. If I tell it who I am and what I had for lunch today, etc., is that actually being recorded somewhere? Could somebody else query it then in the future? Could it be used to access sensitive data if somebody provides it with the correct prompt? We need to make sure that the security in terms of the knowledge that we're providing to these AI is properly locked down, which means you need to really test this stuff. Biases. As with people, AI are only as good as the information that they're and the environment that they're in at the end of the day. And so there have been examples of AI that have provided biased responses that have, for example, treated certain professions as being likely to be a particular gender, or in terms of where it gets its results from and how it weights things. By and large, if you try to push these LLMs for opinions, they won't give you one, but there are ways of manipulating them with those prompts. They're not necessarily completely locked down. And then, yes, if we get this wrong, there is the risk of reputational damage. How would you feel if the emails that you were receiving from the salesperson that you had a really good rapport with turned out to be actually Quanta Mike, for example, turned out to be an AI, not a real person at all? So I think it's really important to actually be upfront about the use of AI. It's not something we should use secretly to pretend that an AI is something it's not. We should be upfront. This is using an AI, and it's an AI that you are interacting with, etc. Just set those expectations, because otherwise there is a real risk of reputational damage if people feel that they've been cheated or in some way deceived, I think. Okay, lovely. So there we go. Pretty much bang on 45 minutes. So does anybody have any questions, either about any of the stuff that I've talked about there, or stuff I've not talked about that you were perhaps hoping that I would cover off as part of this session? If you do have questions, feel free to just chuck them straight into the chat, and I'll respond to those. So I've got a question here from Jason, not me, I promise, which you can see in the chat there, about generating text. So the thing there, Jason, if I'm perfectly honest with you, is what did you use to generate those, if you don't mind me asking? Was that Midjourney or Bing AI? Because the premium versions, using Copilot. Fair enough. So Copilot's not very good at images, is the first thing that I would say. But if you look at something like the premium Midjourney, it can handle text much better. Again, it's because of the probabilities that it's using. And so it looks at it and it doesn't really understand that it's a word, if that makes sense. It just goes, there's letters, aren't there? Well, I know letters, let's chuck some letters on. So as they get better, they will do a better job of this, but you can tune it with prompts. Although I will be perfectly honest with you, I'm not good with image prompts. It is, as I say, it is a skill. I use it a lot for coding and text-based stuff, but down the image route, that's not my area of expertise. But there are, it is just down to the prompts that you give it. But Midjourney's Pro version is much easier when it comes to things like that. Yes, Toby, it absolutely can. So rather confusingly, although putting text into an image is something it struggles with, taking text from an image is something it can actually do a really good job with. And it will use a basic version of, basically sort of like a reverse image search, I suppose. And it will try to identify where that's cropped up before, previous marketing materials, and then it can generate it from that. It can recognize brands, and it can recognize text. So, for example, I've in the past taken a picture of a document, and it can pick out the text from that and then index it and then create links from there, etc. So yes, it can generate marketing content, although again, bear in mind what it's largely going to do is just look at what's been done before and give you something similar. So that's where the prompt crafting then really comes in, so that you can then target specific audiences, etc. And I would still say you would want a marketer there who's got an idea of who they're targeting and how they want that to be done. Michelle, does it integrate well with Excel? Yes, it does. There is an additional cost for that. So the free version, so Copilot is a freemium product, but you can get Copilot for M365, which puts it into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc. And yes, you can get it to do formulas for you. You can get it to identify trends in data, that sort of thing. It's not necessarily great with causation, but pretty good with correlation. So it integrates really well with the Microsoft products. You can use it in Word to write blurbs and documents and that sort of thing. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for Matt. Stable Diffusion 3. Yeah, so different LLMs have different text better at coherence. Magdalena, in terms of what you can combine it with, basically any of the Microsoft stuff, if I'm honest, and they're expanding that. It even works on the admin side of things, although to be honest with you, the licensing at the moment looks a bit prohibitively expensive, if I'm honest. But Word, Excel, PowerPoint, as I've described. Teams, you can have it on Microsoft Teams. Actually, if you record and transcribe your Teams meeting, it can then generate meeting notes and actions and that sort of thing, and then record that in SharePoint or record it in Dynamics or whatever you want to do with it, and send emails out to people afterwards, etc. So you need to kind of teach it to do this stuff, but it's you can integrate it basically with any of the Microsoft stuff. It's going to be everywhere, pretty much whether you want it to be or not. You may have noticed if you use Bing as a search engine that when you ask it things, Copilot now often props up as the top result as well. So it is everywhere. In terms of the data analytics, you will probably need an additional subscription to get it to do the clever data analytics stuff. You can do it using, so Copilot Studio is a premium product, does integrate with Power BI, but you would need to have Power BI as a subscription. And integrating it into the M365 end user apps also requires a subscription as well. It's not that expensive, but it is per user. I'll be honest with you, Microsoft licensing is one of those things that I've never really managed to kind of firmly grasp. There are additional costs. If you want to go beyond some of the kind of basic question and answer and generation stuff, when you want it to do the real heavy lifting, you do end up paying a little bit of money, but it's not a huge amount. It's the admin stuff that really costs. Yes, so as Jamie said there, you can indeed call other LLMs as well. So although I focused on Copilot here, other AI are available and can integrate with the Office apps. There we go. And just reading through Jason's question, yes. So in answer to your question, if you give it the right access to a SharePoint site and give it the correct access to be able to look at the access control list for it, then yes, it is capable of doing those things. Could you put it as a desktop app? Absolutely. So in terms of how you publish it and then make it available on a website, etc., or as a kind of custom web app that people launch, obviously you need internet connectivity. The heavy lifting is done in Azure, but by all means, you can chuck it on the desktop to make it easier to access, or provide a link on the M365 homepage, for example. Yes, you can restrict it to your own content. So that is a really good question, and I can show you that exactly here. Basically, in terms of the knowledge for a custom Copilot, I can just basically say to it, look, it's only going to reference what I've told it. Yeah, forget about the wide world. You know what I've told it, and that is that. So yes, you can create then something that is much more targeted. And in many cases, that might actually be quite appropriate so that it doesn't start pulling things from other locations. I know when I was asking it some questions yesterday about Worcester, it did have to tend to have, in terms of those biases that I talked about, tended to think I was talking about Worcester, Massachusetts, rather than Worcester in Worcestershire, United Kingdom. So yeah, there are definitely things you can do, and yeah, it's as simple as that. Basically, you can really heavily customize these things. You can give them actions to do things like send emails, create documents, and you can also customize the topics that it understands, going all the way through to actually being able to customize the basic flows that it follows, etc., within there as well. So there's a lot that you can do in order to customize this to behave in the way you want it to for your organization. So your own knowledge base, effectively. So in terms of restrictions, in terms of accessing the data, that all comes down to who you publish it to and the data sources permissions as well. So when I've got my knowledge in here, for example, I have the ability, when I add knowledge, you can add these in, okay, but and there's loads, as you can see, of different places that it can get the data from, including more that are coming soon, but it's based on those permissions effectively. So you need to make sure that that's properly locked down, and then you choose where you're actually going to publish it. And you can choose the channels where it is published and then set the permissions there appropriately. Not demonstrated here, but it does support voice as well, so people can actually talk to it. Although I'll be honest with you, like most voice recognition stuff, struggles with accents, struggles with women because a lot of it's trained by men, but it does have that capability. So yeah, it is. Yeah, it's very, very clever. But yeah, I would say, Jason, in terms of your security questions, test it, test it, test it. That's the thing. It should respect security boundaries, but you need to make sure that you've got all of your ACLs set up absolutely bang on. As with anything, when we're exposing data in new ways. Okay. Right. Copilot API calling is coming, or whether don't know. I'm afraid is the answer to that. I would imagine there'll be an API that you can integrate elsewhere soon. But I mean, this is a very young product in Microsoft standards. Well, certainly under the Copilot umbrella. So we shall see. As Paula said, meeting notes is a little flaky. Yeah, absolutely can be. It works, but again, you need that human interaction just to sanity check them. Toby, lots of product images. Yeah, absolutely. So although your product images may not appear anywhere else, you're probably selling things that already exist elsewhere. So yes, it will absolutely be able to produce content based on, as I say, billions of data points. As long as you don't have a product that has literally never been seen before, it will be able to come up with something for you. If you're going to use it for your mid-year appraisal review, you need to create a Michelle profile. Could I get enough out of it by feeding in some key bits first? So you can create your own Copilot and just give it basically as a knowledge base any documents that are relevant. So for example, I don't know, if you've got like KPIs and that sort of information, you could literally feed it into here if you've got a Copilot studio license, and it would then be able to generate basically things based on your information rather than stuff that is necessarily publicly available. Because bear that in mind, if you're not customizing its knowledge, it only knows what everybody else knows. So it only knows publicly available information. So yeah, but you could absolutely go down that route. You can really kind of get lost in the weeds with the customization of these things, but they are really powerful when you've actually got them to that point. Okay, lovely. Any other questions at all around any of that? File types that it cannot read from. Very good question. I'm not sure. Any that have got weird encoding or encryption, I would imagine that it would struggle with. But I think it does okay with things like PDFs, any kind of text-based. Does very well with images. Um, I would imagine if you tried to submit it something like an executable, something like that, it would struggle to be able to compile that at a guess. But as long as it's text based or can be rendered as an image, basically anything that you could basically display anywhere in Microsoft 365, it should be able to digest it. I would imagine works best with text based and databases, that sort of thing, of course. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you very much for your time and attention this morning, everybody. I really hope that was useful. And one last shameless plug, do check out our Copilot for End Users course, which is the tip of the iceberg of Quanta's AI offerings. More coming soon. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure to present to you. Thank you for your participation as well. There's some great questions there at the end. And have a lovely weekend, everybody. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Absolute pleasure.